Day 579 of the Trump administration turns out was the day the president was placed in real legal jeopardy. Here is the story from tomorrow's front page of the New York Times. Cohen pleads guilty, implicating president. The president's former personal lawyer turned himself into the FBI today and then stood in federal court and pleaded guilty to 8 charges, including 2 related to hush money payments to women, which he admitted were at the direction of his boss, Donald Trump, for the purpose of influencing the 2016 election. Cohen pleaded guilty to tax evasion and to lying to a financial institution, as well as 2 campaign finance violations, again, both involving Trump's quest for the White House. The payoffs described match the cases of Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels, already extensively reported down to the amounts. This case is being brought by the feds, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and today the lead prosecutor talked about the charges against Cohen.
He worked to pay money to silence 2 women who had information that he believed would be detrimental to the 2016 campaign and to the candidate and the campaign. In addition, Mr. Cohen sought reimbursement for that money by submitting invoices to the candidate's company, which were untrue and false.
Minutes after the Cohen plea, a jury in Alexandria, Virginia, convicted former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort of filing false tax returns, failing to file foreign bank account reports, and bank fraud. As NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams laid it out for us earlier this evening, the jury found Paul Manafort guilty of intentionally dodging taxes on millions of dollars that he earned as a political consultant for the former president of Ukraine, well before Manafort served briefly as President Trump's campaign chairman. Prosecutors said he stashed the money, as one does, in overseas banks and used it to indulge his expensive tastes in clothes, antiques, and cars by wiring money directly from those accounts to pay his bills, nicely bypassing tax collectors from the IRS. From 2010 through 14, prosecutors said Manafort earned more than $30 million, but reported less than half of that as income. When the Ukrainian money dried up, prosecutors said Manafort lied in applying for more than $20 million in loans from 3 banks to maintain the aforementioned lavish spending habits. The jury convicted him of 2 of those bank fraud counts. In all, Manafort faced 18 criminal counts. The jury convicted him on 8 of them, but couldn't agree on the other 10. Tonight, the president went to West Virginia for a rally. There were the usual chants of drain the swamp and lock her up, but they were not as lusty as past events. And the president's comments, truth be told, were slightly less sharp. After landing and before leaving for the rally, the president approached the traveling news media to comment on the Manafort conviction.
I feel badly about, I must tell you that Paul Manafort's a good man. He was with Ronald Reagan. He was with a lot of different people over the years, and I feel very sad about that. It doesn't involve me, but I still feel, it's a very sad thing that happens. This has nothing to do with Russian collusion. We continue the witch hunt. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, what about Michael Cohen? Any comment on Michael Cohen?
No comment there pointedly on Cohen, who was released on $500,000 bail. His sentencing, interestingly, is scheduled for December 12th. The judge noted that Cohen could serve up to 65 years in prison, though we should hasten to add the prosecutor's recommended sentence is something closer to 4 to 6 years. Manafort is expected to be sentenced to 7 to 9 years when it's all said and done. He also faces another trial on related charges next month in Washington. Meanwhile, both men now join Rick Gates, Michael Flynn, George Papadopoulos on the roster of Trump associates who have faced criminal charges. On that, let us bring in our expanded leadoff panel for a consequential Tuesday evening. Nicolle Wallace has returned to the night shift, the veteran of the Bush White House and host of Deadline White House, 4 p.m. Eastern weekdays on this network. Here in New York, Michael Schmidt. Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Emily Jane Fox, senior reporter for Vanity Fair and biographer of the Trump family. Down in Washington tonight, Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, also happens to be a former senior official at the FBI. And Daniel Goldman, former assistant U.S. attorney for, of all things, the Southern District of New York, the jurisdiction at the center of much of today's news. Welcome to you all. Nicolle, I'd like to begin with you with something. Mr. Goldman's former boss, Preet Bharara, the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, said on Twitter today, just a plain statement of fact, Michael Cohen, in a courtroom in the Southern District of New York, under oath, declared that the president directed him to commit a federal crime. A lot of this, all of this happened while you were on the air this afternoon. Have you had time to inhale just what it is we've witnessed today?
You know what I thought about today? You and I were on the air together on the day of Trump's bizarre inaugural address, which my old boss had some colorful language to describe. George W. Bush called it some crazy bleep. I was thinking about the line about carnage, and I was thinking that the real carnage, and it was all in motion when he gave that speech that day, the real carnage is the people closest to Donald Trump, the lives that are being destroyed for crimes they've committed. I mean, it's not a night to feel sympathy for Michael Cohen, but the events that are sending him to jail, potentially, are events put in motion by the things Donald Trump demanded of the people close to him. It may end up ensnaring his family, but just this idea of wreckage. A source close to Michael Cohen tonight told me that everything Donald Trump touches is tainted by his toxic brew of a lack of ethics and a lack of any adherence to the law. I also thought of something that someone who advises this president said to me earlier in the day, before the 4 o'clock hour. He said, if the president's handing out one pardon today, it's going to Paul Manafort, not Michael Cohen. There's already a sense that if someone does anything out of the desire to sort of salvage any dignity or anything for their family, that they've betrayed him. So this idea of loyalty and this idea of carnage sort of collided after I got off the air today, and it sort of looked at all the wreckage in the lives of these people that went into business with the president, committed crimes perhaps at his behest, and you just see ongoing pileups in the lives of everyone that was associated with this president.
Emily Jane Fox, you're the one among us who has spoken to Michael Cohen in the hours since his appearance in federal court. Tell us about that conversation.
This was an emotional day for Michael Cohen, mostly because of what his family witnessed, and I think that was difficult. He also stood up there. I was in the courtroom today and listened to him go count by count and not only admit that he was guilty to those, but really describe in detail why he was guilty of those crimes. So I watched him get emotional in describing that. And then this evening when I spoke with him, emotional talking about the toll that this took on his family. Something that he stressed to me over and over again, though, was how well he felt like he was treated by law enforcement and by prosecutors. And that was an important message that he wanted to get across. And that was something that he had said in the initial raid of his home, hotel room, and office. And that is, in a way, another contrast with his former boss, someone who has attacked law enforcement over and over again on his Twitter and his speeches. And so this was just another sticking point, even at this emotional, loaded moment in his life where he was trying to plant a flag and say, I'm not like this guy and I'm not going to be like him going forward. I mean,
let me ask you about his family and correct any of this I have wrong. 2 daughters, both under 25. His wife, born in Ukraine, is kind of a dual role as bookkeeper for his legal concern. And having read that, it always made me wonder, were the feds going to dangle that in front of Cohen if she co-signed agreements or checks? If they were going to perhaps say, boy, you really wouldn't want to see your wife go in the federal slammer. Did she have any culpability, any involvement that you know of?
Well, I'll only correct you on the fact that he has a daughter and a son. And
okay, forgive me.
That's it. The rest, I think you're spot on, and I think that that's a very important point. This is a very close-knit marriage. They are people who were very involved in their businesses. As the New York Times reported over the weekend, she's someone who co-signed loan documents, and From all I know in my year of very close reporting on Michael Cohen, he would do anything to save his family from any trouble, any pain, any hardship. And so if his wife were, in fact, in any kind of trouble, that would be a reason for him to take action and to stand up and do something.
Artfully answered, and our thanks. Hey, Michael, all the smart reporters in the business, everything we've seen come and go, every one we've seen come and go, the folks who knew the name of the game kept saying, Cohen is the one. Cohen's the one that could do the most damage here. Cohen's the one to concentrate on. You were among them. Is this kind of what you were talking about?
Go back to the spring. The raid happens, and the president's lawyers say, okay, it's a new front in our legal wars. We know the extent of the Mueller investigation. At least they thought they did. We understand the questions of collusion around the president. We understand obstruction. We have no idea what went on between the president and Michael Cohen. We don't think we're getting truthful answers from the president about it. We do not understand the extent of his criminal exposure. And that is incredibly scary. And up until today, I still do not think that they appreciated just the gravity that this was going to have on the president. And I'm really not sure what they can do at this point. I don't know how they get themselves out of this situation. And that's just one part of the fight. We still haven't seen what Mueller's going to do.
That's exactly right. Daniel, please help us lay people out. Describe the agreement agreed to today, what's in it, what's not. And does this constitute the quick and easy phrase, flipping? Did Michael Cohen flip today? And if not, how shy of that is he?
Well, the big surprise here is that he did not flip. This is not a cooperation agreement. This is a standard plea agreement where Michael Cohen went into court, as we all saw and witnessed, and admitted to committing 8 crimes. But he did not agree to cooperate with the government in any meaningful way, including testifying down the road. And the government did not agree to write a letter to reduce his sentence, which is the benefit that he would have gotten. This is very surprising to me as a former assistant in that office, because all indication is that Michael Cohen is not only willing but desperate to cooperate. So I frankly do not understand exactly what is going on, because it does seem, based on his allocution in court today, where he volunteered. And by the way, when he pointed at the president, that was unnecessary. That was something he did not need to say in order to fulfill his obligation to allocute to the judge. It's not in the information. It is something that he added himself to essentially make the president an unindicted co-conspirator, even though he is not referenced that way in the information. So he clearly wants to cooperate, but this is not a cooperation agreement.
And Daniel, I got to say, he's got Lanny Davis appearing on this network on CNN tonight, certainly indicating there's more. There are stories to tell, including but not limited to advanced knowledge of Russian hacking, a point Omarosa last made a few days ago.
It's almost as if they're begging to have a meeting with prosecutors. And as a former prosecutor, I would, and I'm sure Chuck will say the same, we would offer that meeting any day of the week. So it is very surprising, given the foreshadowing that Lanny Davis is making, given what he said in court today. That's enough to pique the prosecutor's interest. It certainly piques our interest. So the only other explanation is that the prosecutors don't feel like he's told them the truth. Maybe they've met, but I don't think there's been enough time that they could have been meeting over these past couple of weeks, and for the prosecutors to believe that he's not truthful. So the final conclusion, the only thing that makes any sense to me, is that this is a marker. This is a placeholder before Labor Day, before we get into election season, so that they don't disrupt anything and can't be accused of disrupting anything related to the election, have him plead guilty to what we all know that he's under investigation for, and then they'll sort of begin the cooperation process, which requires many, many meetings between Cohen and the prosecutors and investigators.
Okay, Chuck, it all comes down to you. In the moment, as this was happening today, I heard several very good legal minds open the door and toss out the phrase, unindicted co-conspirator. It had me flashing back to 1974 and 5. Is it a term of art in the law? Can it be applied to one Donald Trump after a day like today?
It is a term of art in the law, Brian, and I think it can be applied to the President of the United States as of today. I mean, we've thrown it around before, but today we had someone stand up in court under oath. By the way, it wasn't just any someone. It was the president's personal lawyer who said that I was directed to do this by Donald Trump. It's a remarkable thing. Daniel's right. Cohen did not need to go there, but he did. One other point I'd like to amplify. I think, like Daniel, I am a bit confused as to why there was no cooperation agreement in this, or no cooperation language in this agreement. But nothing in this agreement precludes him from cooperating down the road. And so it may well be a marker, as Daniel said. The cooperation may follow. It certainly seems like Mr. Cohen and his team are foreshadowing that. And if he's truthful and he's helpful, I'm quite certain the government will be interested.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.